First Sergeant Leonard Lomell pushed across the cratered plateau at the top of Pointe du Hoc. He had been shot in the side, leading his men off the landing craft moments earlier. The Rangers had come for 6 heavy guns, 155mm pieces with a range of 14 miles, decided to fire on Omaha Beach to the east and Utah Beach to the west. Lomell reached the first gun position and climbed over the lip of the casement. It was empty. Where the gun should have stood, there was a telephone pole wrapped in camouflage netting. He moved along the line of casements. Every one of them was the same. The guns were not on Pointe du Hoc. General Omar Bradley called it the most dangerous battery in France. 6 heavy guns sat on the headland, with the range to fire on both American invasion beaches. If the battery fired on the morning of the 6th, the landings would be cut apart before the men reached the sand. The job went to Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, 33 years old, a former football coach from Eden, Texas, and he divided his force into 3. Rudder took Force A himself, 225 Rangers of the 2nd Battalion. They would scale the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc at hitch hour, destroy the guns and cut the coastal highway behind the battery. Force B, Captain Ralph Goranson's company of 68 men, would land 4 miles to the east on a sector of Omaha Beach called Charlie and clear the German positions on the headland above. The remaining force, consisting of more than 500 Rangers of the 5th Battalion and 2 companies of the 2nd, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, would wait offshore as Force C. If Rudder signalled "Praise the Lord" by 0700 hours, Force C would land at the base of the cliffs and exploit the success. If the signal came late, or not at all, they would divert to Omaha Beach and fight overland to Pointe du Hoc. At 0430 hours, Force A left the transport ships and formed up in the channel for the run to Pointe du Hoc, 10 British landing craft and 4 dock amphibious trucks. The seas were rough from the start and the LCAs were taking channel water over the gunwales before they had cleared the transport. The first loss came within minutes. LCA 860, carrying Captain Harold Slater and most of D Company's headquarters, was swamped by a wave and went under. Slater and most of his men were pulled from the water hours later, but 4 Rangers had drowned. A supply craft carrying the battalion's 81mm mortars and extra ammunition had sank shortly after. One of the ducks took a 20mm anti-aircraft round and went down 300 yards from shore, killing or wounding 5 of its 9-man crew. The flotilla's guide was a Royal Navy motor launch fitted with new radar navigation equipment. The equipment malfunctioned, and in the smoke and rough water, the guide vessel drifted east with the tide. The rest of the force followed. At about 100 yards from the beach, First Sergeant Leonard Lomell, standing in LCA 668, looked at the cliffs ahead and realised they were wrong. The headland in front of them was Pointe de la Percée, which was Goranson's target, 3 miles east of where they should be. He turned to his platoon sergeant, Jack Kuhn, and told him they were headed for C Company's beach. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, in the command craft, had already seen it. He ordered the flotilla to turn west and run parallel to the coast towards Pointe du Hoc. For the next 3 miles, the Rangers sat in open boats, broadside to the cliffs, under fire from German positions on the heights above them. They could not return fire and they could not get out of range. They could only keep going. The hitch hour had been 0630. The naval bombardment had been planned to finish at the moment the Rangers touched the beach, so that the German defenders would still be in their shelters when the climbing started. The shelling had been over for 45 minutes, and the defenders were back at the cliff edge watching the LCAs come in. While Force A's flotilla was still running west towards Pointe du Hoc, Captain Ralph Goranson's C Company, 68 Rangers in 2 landing craft, approached Charlie sector at the western edge of Omaha Beach, tasked with destroying the German positions on the headland above. Goranson's LCA took artillery rounds before the ramp dropped. 12 Rangers were dead in the boat. The second craft drew concentrated machine gun fire as the ramp came down, and 15 more men were killed or wounded before stepping off. In the minutes it took to reach the sand at the foot of the bluffs, half of C Company was gone. Sergeant Julius Belcher bled the climb with a bayonet, cutting handholds up the face. Lieutenant Bill Moody reached the top and dropped ropes for the others. At the top of the bluff, Goranson turned his company east, directly toward the German positions, pouring fire onto the men coming ashore at Dog Green. Belcher kicked open the door of a pillbox and threw a white phosphorus grenade inside. The Germans ran out screaming. Goranson kept his men moving east along the bluff, working through the dugouts and trenches one position at a time. 35 of his 68 Rangers became casualties. They killed 68 German soldiers and one officer, and silent positions on the headland that had been pouring fire onto the 116th Infantry on the beaches below. At 0710, Force A's surviving landing craft ground onto the narrow strip of beach at the base of the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc. The men had been in open boats and under fire for the last 40 minutes of the crossing. Rockets fired from the LCAs at the moment they beached. 6 grapnels per craft, each trailing a rope to the cliff top 100 feet above. Most failed. The channel crossing had soaked the ropes through, and the waterlogged lines were too heavy for the rockets to carry. Of 54 grapnels fired across the flotilla, only 19 caught hold on the cliff edge. Burning fuses had been tied to the grapnel lines. Germans who reached for them saw the sparks and pulled back, mistaking the fuses for explosive charges. At the waterline, Sergeant Dominic Bogetto opened fire with his BAR at a German soldier appearing over the cliff above. The body tumbled off the cliff and landed on the beach. First Sergeant Lomell stepped off his craft ramp onto the surf, took a round in his right side, and kept moving towards the base of the cliff. The USS Satterley closed to within 100 yards of shore, dangerously close for a destroyer, and raked the cliff top with her 5-inch guns, driving the German defenders back from the edge long enough for the first Rangers to start climbing. Sergeant Bill Vaughan, the company's best climber, went up a toggle rope with his BAR strapped across his back. Corporal Edward Smith grabbed a straight rope on the next craft over and scrambled up behind him. The first Rangers pulled themselves over the edge, the rest followed over the next 10 minutes, hand over hand on the soaked ropes, while German fire cracked off the cliff face around them. The Rangers who reached the top found a landscape the bombardment had destroyed. Germans appeared from their surviving sections of the underground trench network, fired and disappeared again before the Rangers could fix their positions. Friends and enemies used the same craters for cover, sometimes only yards apart. Rudder set up his command post at the edge of the cliff. The battalion's SCR 300 radios were dead, every set waterlogged beyond repair during the crossing. Lieutenant Ike Eichner, the communications officer, pulled out the equipment the men had grumbled about carrying, a World War I signal lamp with a telescopic sight and shutters for Morse code. It was the only working link to the fleet. Eichner used it to contact USS Satterley and directed her 5-inch guns onto a German machine gun position on the eastern cliff edge that had been firing down on the Rangers during the climb. Satterley blew the position off the face of the cliff. The companies fanned out across the plateau towards their assigned gun positions. Every casement was empty. Telephone poles wrapped in camouflage netting, where 6 heavy guns should have stood. Lomell pushed his D Company section south to the coastal highway and set up a roadblock that was the second half of the mission. While his men dug in along the road, he noticed a sunken farm track ran south from the highway, screened by hedgerows on both sides. The dirt was torn up with tyre tracks, deep ruts too heavy for any farm wagon. At 0710, Lieutenant Colonel Schneider sat offshore in his landing craft, listening for Rudder's signal. The deadline had passed. Schneider gave the order to divert to Omaha Beach. The first wave, A and B companies of the 2nd Rangers, landed on the Dog Green sector at approximately 0715. They had landed in a killing ground. The Vierville Draw, the only paved road off the beach, was directly in front of them, and the Germans had fortified every yard of high ground around it. Lieutenant Robert Edlins was shot in both legs before he reached the sand. Of the 35 Rangers in his element, only 6 had reached the bluffs. An adjacent landing craft carrying B Company Rangers took a direct mortar hit as it beached, leaving no survivors. Schneider watched the first wave from 1,000 yards out. He had 13 landing craft behind him carrying the entire 5th Ranger Battalion, consisting of more than 400 men. He made the decision that saved most of them. Instead of following A and B companies into Dog Green, He turned the 5th 1,000 yards east towards Dog White sector, where grass fires ignited by the naval bombardment and a burning vessel offshore had laid a curtain of smoke across the beach. Brigadier General Norman Cota, the 51-year-old Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, came ashore on Dog White at approximately 0730. What he found was a beach that had stopped moving. The men from the 29th Infantry Division were pressed flat behind the seawall and the shingle, and no one had gone up the bluffs. Bodies lay at the waterline. Cota strode upright along the seawall, in full view of the German positions on the heights above, grabbing men by their equipment and hauling them to their feet. At approximately 0800, he reached the 5th Rangers, pinned behind the same wall. He turned to Schneider and said, "Well, God damn it, if you are Rangers, then get up there and lead the way." Rangers blew 4 gaps in the concertina wire with Bangalore torpedoes. The first man through was shot dead by a sniper. Cota walked through the next gap himself. The 5th Rangers and elements of the 116th Infantry poured through behind him and stormed up the bluffs. One of the first breakthroughs on Omaha Beach. While the 5th Rangers fought up the bluffs at Omaha, Lomell took Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn and started down the Sunken Road. 200 yards south of the highway, screened by hedgerows on both sides, Lomell reached the end of the lane and looked over the last hedgerow into a sunken apple orchard. 5 155mm guns stood in battery formation with ammunition stacked and ready to fire. The guns were unguarded. Lomell told Kuhn to cover him and crossed into the orchard alone. He pulled 2 thermite grenades and placed them in the recoil and traversing mechanisms of the first 2 guns. Thermite burns at 2500 degrees. It melted through the gears and breech blocks, fusing the moving parts into solid metal. Lomell placed grenades in the traversing and elevation mechanisms of the remaining guns and pulled the pins. He wrapped his field jacket around his Thompson submachine gun and smashed the sights of all 5 guns. The whole event took less than 10 minutes, and the thermite never made a sound. While Lomell was finishing destroying the guns, Sergeant Frank Rupinski led an E Company patrol and found the main ammunition dump. They packed it with explosive charges and detonated it. Rupinski's patrol also found the 6th gun and disabled it with a thermite grenade down the barrel. At 0900, the mission was done. Eichner aimed the signal lamp at Satterley and blinked the message, "Located at Pointe du Hoc, mission accomplished, need ammunition and reinforcement, many casualties." The reply came back from General Hebner, "All Rangers have landed at Omaha, no reinforcements available." As daylight began to fade, the Rangers held an L-shaped perimeter straddling the coastal highway south of the point, with Rudder's command post in a captured German bunker on the cliff edge. At 2100 hours, 23 men walked out of the darkness from the east. Lieutenant Charles Parker from the 5th Rangers, with 20 German prisoners in tow. Parker's platoon had fought 6 miles overland from Omaha Beach through German-held country, the only element of Force C to reach the point on D-Day. German probes came that evening, elements of the 726th Grenadier Regiment testing the line. The Rangers pushed them back. At 2300, the 914th Grenadier Regiment hit the perimeter harder, experienced troops trained in night fighting. The Americans, outnumbered and low on ammunition, could not hold the southern line. Lomell and the survivors pulled back north towards the point. The Germans followed, pushing across the highway and deep into the headland, driving through the American position and splitting it in 2. The Rangers fell back to a tight perimeter just a few hundred metres around the command post. The Germans pressed the line through the remaining hours of darkness, and the Rangers held against every push until the attack was repelled before dawn. Ammunition for American weapons was gone. The Rangers picked up captured rifles and submachine guns from the German dead and waited for the next attack. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed at the base of the cliffs the previous morning, only 90 were still standing. On the morning of June 8th, the relief column attacked from the east. The 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions, the 1st Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment, and tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion. The lead elements reached the Ranger perimeter and nearly opened fire. The men on the cliff edge were shooting captured German weapons, and the relief force heard German firearms, not American ones. The confusion held for a long moment until the Rangers stepped out of their positions waving American flags. At 1100 hours, Pointe du Hoc was fully in Allied hands.